everyone. This is Bridgit Danner. We're here for the Leaky Gut Solutions webinar. Thank you for being here. Just bear with me for a moment as I try to get our guest on here. Okay, here we go.
You got it. Awesome.
Here's me. Okay, we're making
Good
progress.
picture.
Yeah, this
You
is an
look
old
awesome.
picture, but I just really like this one, so I keep using it. So most of you probably know me because most of you are on my newsletter list, but some people may have found this through social media. So I'll just do a quick introduction. This is me, and this is my organization, Women's Wellness Collaborative. So before I became an online entity, I was an acupuncturist for 13 years. I did 12,000 treatments. And towards the end of that, I get more interested in functional medicine and nutrition and coaching, and eventually became a functional diagnostic nutrition coach, which I suppose is a melding of all those things. And more recently, I've been really delving into essential oils. So that's a little bit about me. And here's you, Kiran.
Hey, that looks familiar.
So I wrote your little bio here, so you can tell me if I'm right or you can elaborate. You're a microbiologist. You also do a lot of clinical research. You're the inventor of MegasporeBiotics that we'll talk more about today. The co-owner of Microbiome Labs. It's Megaspore's parent company. And I know you're working on a few new products through that company as well. Yeah, you want to tell us what you're up to and what you've been researching lately?
Yeah, so we have 11 active human clinical trials going on right now. So we're putting a lot into the science. We've got almost 500 patients in studies right now in many different places. We work with a lot of top-notch universities like Cleveland Clinic, University of California, San Diego, University of California, Davis, Thomas Jefferson University. So we're doing awesome, really cool, super nerdy scientific work, and really our goal is to understand, what aspects of the microbiome are causing disease dysfunction, and then of course can we fix those aspects utilizing the right type of probiotics and or other compounds as well. So we've got a huge variety of things we're studying right now. We're doing studies on acne. We're doing studies on rheumatoid arthritis, on weight management, on diabetes, on Hashimoto's, C. diff. So we're doing a huge variety of studies on periodontal disease. All of it. What's interesting about this is that, we're talking about the same exact mechanisms, which is leaky gut, that leads to things like Hashimoto's or rheumatoid arthritis or periodontal disease or acne. Those are all very different manifestations of conditions, but they all have the same root cause. And that's why we can study, right, such a big variety of things. When we have a solution for leaky gut, we can help so many different aspects of health and wellness. One of the most exciting studies that we're going to be starting in the next 8 weeks is a study on the impact of glyphosate, the herbicide, in the active ingredient in Roundup, on a child microbiome. So what we want to see is exactly how glyphosate destroys the microbiome, what organisms it destroys. There is some good data out there in animal models, but nobody has done it in a human microbiome before. We also want to look at how it disrupts the functionality of the microbiome, and then the most important part: can we rescue that disruption? So it'll be the first time anybody's ever studied that. So that's really fun and exciting as well. And we've got a couple new products coming out to offer a complete gut restoration system, because the spores that we work on do a phenomenal job of healing the leaky gut and increasing the diversity of the microbiome and increasing the metabolic functionality of the microbiome. So it does all of these amazing things within the microbiome. There are a couple other components that we think need even further support. One of it is further growth of certain key organisms within the gut, and that would be through a prebiotic. And then the next part is the mucosal lining itself. The mucosal lining and the structure and function of the mucosal lining plays a significant role in most chronic diseases. So we want to enhance the capability of the body to repair its mucosal lining. I already peeked at a couple of the questions, and a couple of those questions, the answer is going to be, you've got to fix your mucosal lining. So, yeah. So,
Yeah, and I didn't really tell everybody before they came on, but basically what we're presenting today is our new shop, and our new shop has your product and then two more to help with that mucosal lining and just help assist the Megaspore work better. So probably, they're similar to some things you're developing or some of the
mhm.
other products you already have in the commercial line, so to speak. So yeah, I think it's going to be a great like synergy of all the things. So
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah. So I've been messing just now with my volume, and I think I have it turned up higher for myself. But if you want to comment in the comment box, if it seems higher or not, let me know. It's a little bit hard to make Kiran and I's volume equal because we're just coming from two different like inputs. But if you have any comments, let us know. Okay, let's see what we got next here. Trying to forward this, but it's stuck. Oh my goodness. Let's see. Is it spacebar? Is it this one? Sorry, guys. I'm a little froze up here. Oh, there we go. So here's some of the symptoms of leaky gut. And like you said, Kiran, it's not just having an upset stomach. It's really like acne. It's definitely lots of skin issues, headaches because there's more inflammation in your body. So here's just a few of the things it's connected with: depression because of the neurotransmitter connection, autoimmunity certainly. So here's a little picture of leaky gut. Kiran, you can help me kind of define it.
Mm-hmm.
So there's this mucosal lining, and there's really just a single layer of cells, right, in that
Mm-hmm.
upper lining. So that's a pretty, and you think about it, a pretty delicate structure, only a single layer of cells. And if you
Yeah.
can see from this picture, these two cells are a little bit separated where the arrows are coming through, and those should be tight together. So that is actually what we're calling leaky gut. Is it the epithelial cell junctions are coming apart, and they're supposed to be tight together. So when they come apart, a couple things happen. Some particles that were too big to meant to be entered the bloodstream, possibly pathogenic, but just generally disruptive, come through that lining. And another thing that's happening at the same time is there's inflammation along that barrier, and that inflammation is blocking some of the cilia that help absorb the nutrients. So it's two things happening at once. One is there's a lack of nutrient absorption, and the other is these particles coming in. And when these are coming into the bloodstream and your liver can't keep up, and there's this new load that wasn't meant to be there, that's a strain on your organs of detoxification and your immune system. And this image at the top is kind of showing some of the causes. Stress. Kiran, you gave a great lecture on how stress affects the gut and how mindfulness helps, so we can talk more about that. Toxins,
Mm-hmm.
like you mentioned, glyphosate is a pesticide that is sprayed on many foods in this country. And then the food particles is just the undigested food through the leaky gut. Medications can play a part. Gut infections are usually a part of leaky gut. And then this says organ malfunction, which is kind of true. But, I think our organs are meant to function properly. And it's usually just when we're not giving them the right input that there's some error there. Do you want to comment on it, this slide, Kiran?
Yeah, so the title of the slide is progression, leaky gut progression. So it always starts off with something that perturbs the ecology in the digestive system. So your gastrointestinal tract has this really complex ecology. It's got hundreds of millions of bacteria. There are thousands of different species of bacteria, and they all have to kind of work in concert in order to produce certain metabolites that control the tight junctions, that space in between the cells, also to reduce inflammation, to continue to regenerate the mucus layer, which you don't see on this particular diagram, but there's a thick mucus layer on top of those cells that act as a physical barrier, not allowing things like bacterial components and viral components and food particles to come and mingle with those cells. That one cell thick lining that basically separates the outside world from the inside of your body. So once things migrate right through where the arrows are showing, it enters something called the basolateral layer, which is where your circulation is. So the whole job of that one cell thick lining and the mucosal lining on top of that is to separate all of the things in the outside world that would cause significant amount of fright and inflammation to your immune system if it's allowed to penetrate through. So just think of it as living in a house where you have walls that have massive holes in them, right? So your house is really, the walls of your house really act as a protective barrier from the elements outside, which could include people. It could include animals and weather and things like that. Imagine your house has massive 4-foot holes all over the walls. It would cause a significant amount of perturbation and stress on the inside part of the house. That's exactly what's happening. So when you have leaky gut, which starts off with a dysbiotic flora, so it could be a single course of antibiotics you took when you were 6 years old for an ear infection, that would start the process of your flora becoming dysbiotic, and then the microbiome is not strong enough to protect you from the cells opening up and the inflammation settling in. And so this is what I call the ground zero of most health disorders, because this process of the permeability of the intestines and the toxins that leak through and the type of inflammation they cause has been shown to be at the core of the onset of most chronic illnesses, things like heart disease, diabetes, obesity. Recently, I just saw a whole bunch of studies on endometriosis, infertility, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, autoimmune diseases, a whole vast majority of autoimmune diseases, really, most things that are not just singularly directly caused by a pathogen, even periodontal disease, of course, anxiety, depression, even things like low testosterone levels, hypogonadism in men, estrogen dominance in women. All of these things are driven by a loss of this barrier in your intestinal lining and things leaking through on a regular basis and activating the immune system in a really unfavorable way. So the whole goal here is, we can do a whole bunch of therapies to try to improve the conditions and the symptoms of most of those chronic illnesses that are driven by this mechanism. But if we don't stop that constant flow of toxins getting in through the intestinal lining, we can never make significant progress in the disease. Now, that's the reason why a lot of people, for example, that end up with the autoimmune disease could end up with multiple autoimmune diseases over a period of time. It might start with just lupus, and then the lupus you'll add on Hashimoto's, and then you'll add on a rheumatoid arthritis, and then you'll end up with psoriasis. And so all of these things compound on one another because that constant flow of toxins that activate the disease is always there. So that's why this is so important. If we don't address this, you really can't make any progress on chronic illness.
Yeah, that's really well said. I just want to share a couple things. One is I do a hormone business, right? And my first products I'm introducing are for the gut. So why is that, right?
Right.
It might seem like people are like, well, just tell me what herbs to take for my hormone. It's like, you got to get this piece fixed. You really, and really the second reason I started out with this is because I really wanted to offer unique products that I knew worked really well and you can't find elsewhere. And that's what we're introducing today. So I'm still sort of working on my best hormone kit, but this baby I think is really strong, and it's really important, like you said. I just want to share one historical story too. My first study is Chinese medicine, and it's thousands of years old. And over time, over the history of time, there's been different theories that dominate the thinking and the medicine. And one of them was by the Earth School. So the earth element represents the digestion in Chinese medicine. And the Earth School believed that all diseases started in the gut, essentially. So this is not a new concept, but certainly we're faced with many new barriers to health in our modern
Hmm.
world, including like the glyphosate you mentioned, and this chronic stress from being always on electronics and all this. And so it's really a big problem, and I think we've driven that point home. So so that's
Hmm.
good. Okay. Now I have to see again how I move forward because it never lets me. There we go. So, Kiran, I mentioned that you gave a great webinar on stress and how it affects the gut. Do you want to just speak briefly on that connection?
Yeah, so there was a great meta-analysis paper. If you're not familiar with what that term means, meta-analysis is where a group of researchers will review a whole bunch of studies in a particular category from a bunch of different sources, and then they'll come to a consensus conclusion on what all of those studies are basically saying. And those meta-analysis papers are really useful to kind of bring a whole bunch of scientific information together under one conclusion. So there was a great meta-analysis paper published in the Frontiers of Immunology back in 2015, and they basically concluded that stress-induced endotoxemia, or leaky gut, was the #1 cause of morbidity and mortality worldwide. So they basically showed that the type of leaky gut that is induced by stress, it drives the vast majority of chronic illnesses that kill the vast majority of people in the developed world. And
Mm.
so, we always knew that stress was not good for us, but we didn't really understand the implications. Stress could be worse than smoking, could be worse than a poor diet, could be worse than doing drugs or drinking too much. Stress has such a powerful innate effect on the ability of our gut and microbiome to function, and then our immune system as well, that it was deemed to be the #1 cause of mortality and morbidity worldwide. Also, what we know is that when your body releases stress hormones, that actually increases the virulence capability of latent enzymes and viruses and bacteria. So we know we've all been exposed to things like Epstein-Barr virus and herpes simplex and cytomegalovirus, which many of these viruses can remain latent in your body, and latent meaning they're there, but they're not causing disease. The moment you get stressed, and the release of those stress hormones can actually activate these organisms to start becoming infective. And when they become infective, they create a whole other host of inflammatory responses that can lead to autoimmune disease and obesity, and even the onset of things like Parkinson's and diabetes and so on. So stress cannot be overstated in terms of its role in chronic disease and its role in the inability of people to heal from their conditions.
Yeah, and I want to elaborate this in functional medicine. Stress isn't just traffic jams; it's really like a lot of things, and
Mm-hmm.
it definitely, I think you really live this, Kiran, so well. Like you're just a very joyful person, and you encourage connection, and that is very big. It's not
Mm-hmm.
just saying, oh well, if I didn't have traffic. It's really creating a life of joy and
Yeah.
appreciation, and finding what that is. And then there's internal stressors as well, like
Yeah.
the things we just talked about, or being in chronic pain. Someone asked about parasites. So this next slide is, kind of showing some of the progression, which I think we've covered. And you mentioned some of these conditions too. Its involvement in weight gain and skin issues. So here are some signs and symptoms that you could have leaky gut. Karen, what would you say if you had to guess? What percentage of people do you think have leaky gut?
So, and I don't even have to really guess, because we were studying this before. So what we saw in our first study on leaky gut, when we took healthy young college students, these are people in the prime of their lives, so no symptoms of any chronic illness at all. They're perfectly healthy when you look at them clinically. 55% of them had severe leaky gut. right? So that's people without any sort of
Wow.
symptomology, right? And
Yeah.
and people who are not obese, they're you know, in the prime of their lives, essentially. When you look at people who are in the 30s, 40s, and beyond, and you have some sort of symptomology, meaning you have something as simple as allergies, or you have you know, chronic restless sleep, and you have fatigue, you have low energy levels throughout the day, just simple things like that, some brain fog, all of those things are indicative of leaky gut. My best guess, if you take an average person who's 30 in the workforce, maybe either has a family or does not have a family, but has, you know, your typical Western life, we would probably be more than 80% of people will
Mm.
have severe leaky gut. And one of the things we saw in the college screening study that we did was that those that had leaky gut, the 55% that we saw had leaky gut, their leaky gut got worse in 30 days, in the 30-day period that we were observing them.
Just
It got about,
observing them. Huh.
just observing that, it got 32% worse from day 1 to day 30. So the you know, the severity of the condition tends to get worse over time, and it especially gets worse as you start losing blood sugar control, as you start putting on a little bit of extra body weight. We know that you know, having a little extra body weight can increase the toxic and leaky gut response when you're eating food by 25-30%. You know, and then we know as you get older, the diversity of your microbiome shrinks, and as the diversity of the microbiome shrinks, the leakiness of your gut increases as well. And that's part of why, as you get older, you're more susceptible to chronic illnesses. You know, it's not just you have more bad luck as you're older. You know, why is it that you know, people in their 40s, 50s, and beyond have a significant higher risk of developing numerous chronic illnesses versus people who are in their late teens and early 20s? It's because people in their 40s, 50s, and beyond tend to have much more intense and frequent leaky gut and endotoxemia, which is a big driver of all
Mm.
of these diseases.
Yeah, well, that's great you've done the research because I would have just guessed.
Hmm.
But yeah, I think it's the majority. And
Hmm.
I don't know the exact percentage. I get an email before, you know, is it genetics that there's so much leaky gut in the family? I mean, I guess I let you elaborate on that, but I almost say if you don't have leaky gut, you've got some really great genes because there's so much going
Hmm.
against you nowadays. So the genetic thing, I think you can speak to that. Could be a component, but really anybody is susceptible to, you know, the stresses of the modern world. And like you said, with aging, there's less
Yeah.
stomach acid and less biodiversity. So yeah, anybody is really a possible candidate.
Yeah, I mean, you
So
know, 90% of the functionality of your gut lining, the mucosal lining that we talked about, and then the intestinal epithelial lining is controlled by the functions of your microbiome. Now, we do know that there are some genes that play a role in increasing your risk factors for leaky gut. But if you have those genes, if you have those SNPs, what we call them, single nucleotide polymorphism. If you're not familiar with that word, it basically means it's a single nucleotide. You know, if we go back to old biology 101, our DNA is made up of things called nucleotides, A, T, G, and C. There's 4 different nucleotides arranged in all these different codes. For, you know, a gene could have 100 nucleotides or 1,000 nucleotides or more. And if you have an error in the copying of that gene, you could switch one of your A's with a T, and that's a single nucleotide polymorphism, meaning a single nucleotide has been switched, and that completely changes the function of the gene. So there are certain identified SNPs that will increase your risk for leaky gut. But what is clear is that the genetics drive a very small percentage of it, meaning you could have all of the genetic markers that lend to a high risk of leaky gut, but never have leaky gut if you have a very healthy microbiome. Or you could have no genetic risk factors and still have severe leaky gut because the microbiome is perturbed. So we're actually doing a study on this too. So the next leaky gut study that we're doing that will start probably in September, we're adding the genetic component to it too, to see what percentage of the people that end up having severe leaky gut also have all the genetic risk factors. But based on the existing data, I would say that genetics play about a 10% influence on your risk for leaky gut. Most of it is controlled by the microbiome.
Interesting. Yeah, and I think another reason I chose this kit to start out with is that so many people have leaky gut, and it's something that is approachable, that we can deal with without a lot of special testing. Some people have asked about parasites and candida infection, and we can, without testing, we can take a stab at those. But I find it's more effective to test and see, did our parasite protocol work? So this is really one that I think is great. And some practitioners may not start with fortifying the gut. They might start with killing things, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
But I find, and I observe in our clients, that if you don't fortify that gut, it's pretty traumatizing to go through a parasite protocol or some, intensive protocol. So I think it's great to nourish that mucosal layer and just help the bacterial balance so that when you get in to do some killing, things are friendlier. So let's get into some treatment. We're talking about removing triggers of leaky gut. We'll get deeper into that, but some of the toxins in our diet and the stress and the processed foods, rebuilding your gut. We'll talk more about that today. And then fixing the root causes can be a little bit more, with testing, but some of the root causes you can know about if you are in chronic stress or, you're hating your job. Those can be root causes as well. Here's a few triggers to think about. So gluten releases something called zonulin, which can open up that gut lining. And Kiran, I know that you can tolerate some gluten because you've got such a diverse gut. Do you want to talk a little bit about how Megaspore can help increase, the ability of you to eat more foods?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a couple of issues, with gluten. We'll address gluten first, and then we'll talk about the spores. One of the biggest problems with gluten is that it also comes covered in this glyphosate, right? And glyphosate is that herbicide in Roundup, and what the studies so far have shown is that it's a strong antibiotic, but it's the worst kind of antibiotic because it selectively kills good bacteria. It actually allows certain categories, especially very problematic categories of bad bacteria, to flourish. Things like Clostridia, Klebsiella, Salmonella, all of these kind of pathogenic, problematic organisms start to flourish in the presence of glyphosate, and then a lot of your good bacteria will start to die off because of the presence of the glyphosate. So it's like the worst kind of antibiotic you can have because it specifically kills good guys. And so gluten is this tiny little protein essentially that is antigenic, meaning your immune system will recognize it as something that it needs to pay attention to. It doesn't necessarily attack it, but it recognizes it as something that it needs to pay attention to. Now, the interesting thing is that most of these kind of little pieces of protein that come in through the diet are broken up and digested by your digestive enzymes, right? So your pancreatic enzymes and the enzymes produced by the microbiome will break down these little pieces of protein so that you don't end up triggering an immune response by them, because the enzymes will cut them up into individual amino acids or little groups of 2 amino acids. At that point, they're not antigenic anymore, meaning they can't stimulate their immune response. Now, gluten has this particular type of structure, and it's also fat soluble, so that what it does is it can hide in fat in the meal, so it doesn't get cut up by the enzymes, and so it's present in its full structure in the intestines. And if it's allowed to migrate towards the intestinal lining, it can trigger a severe immune response. However, like Bridgit mentioned, I can eat gluten, for example, and I don't get any negative response from it. And the reason is because my immune system has figured out to build a tolerance against it. Because anything that's not particularly harmful to your system, meaning it's not a pathogenic virus or bacteria or a parasite, your immune system should develop something called oral tolerance, meaning when it sees it, it should recognize it as something that is foreign, but it's not harmful. So we don't need to elicit a complex inflammatory immune response to it. That oral tolerance, that ability to develop oral tolerance, is controlled by the microbiome. The microbiome will stimulate your immune cells to release something called Treg cells. And these are regulatory T cells. They're part of your immune system that kind of floats around and surveys all the different immune responses. And when it sees an immune response that is not favorable, that shouldn't be happening, like an immune response to soy or to ragweed or to pollen or to some sort of protein, it'll suppress that immune response, thereby teaching your immune system that it doesn't have to attack that thing anymore. And that's how you get tolerance. Now, what we were able to see with the spores in the Megaspore product is that these spores seem to increase the expression of those Treg cells. So as you get enough doses of the spores in you, it'll help stabilize your immune response by increasing these Treg cells so that your immune system can develop tolerance against all these things that it shouldn't be attacking. Because at the end of the day, humans are genetically and evolutionarily designed to be omnivores, right? We moved up the evolutionary ladder because we can eat almost anything. If you take like a lion, for example, a lion is an obligate carnivore, and it cannot eat a plant. If a lion ate a plant or a root or tuber or seeds, it would get very sick and its system wouldn't be able to handle it. And that's why the lion has certain restrictions in its ability to move up the food chain, because it only has certain sources of food. If there's a drought and its main prey is in low prevalence, then the lion will die of starvation. The same thing with obligate herbivores like the wildebeest and things like that have to graze. If there's a drought and their vegetation is low, then they're going to die. They're not going to be able to move up and propagate their species. But humans, we dig for roots and tubers, we eat animals, we eat seeds, we eat insects, we can eat all kinds of crazy stuff, and our system should be is designed to do that. So if you have a bunch of food intolerances, it's a real clear signal that there's a big perturbation in your microbiome. Your immune response is not upregulated to produce the Treg cells to allow oral tolerance. That was a super long answer, sorry.
No, people love it. People love to hear that science behind it, so it's really great. Let me maybe move into some of the supplements, because I think we've given a pretty good background. I do like this image, so I'll talk about this one quickly, which is there's a lot that you can do, on your own that's basic and important. You need to eat a whole food diet. You need to move your body. You need to get a good night's sleep. You need to eat organic as much as possible. These are all really important basics. And we're almost moving up into the informed self-care today with this kit we'll show. But really let everything we've talked about, be a foundation. And also know, I hear a lot, oh, well, I think food cures everything and just eat right. Yes, and it's not the only piece, especially if you've gotten yourself into ill health. The seesaw has been tipped, and your body needs some help to get back into that. So here's some of the food factors that we've talked about. Kiran, something that you say that I've quoted a lot is just to really eat that wide variety of food, eat international foods. Don't just buy the same 3 vegetables every time you go to the store, because your bacteria, there's, to promote the diversity of bacteria, you need a diversity of fibers. So I think that that's a really important piece there.
Yeah.
And I'm going to cut ahead a bit because I know people want to hear more about the supplements. So this is a kit that I developed, and this first product you see on the left is Kiran's formula, the MegasporeBiotic, which is a supplement I've been using for 2 or 3 years. Really great success. I think I only just this last week has had a first sort of bad reaction, and really that's probably just having to go a lot slower. The second product is called GI Restore, and it's a powder you mix with water. It's really more about helping that inflammatory environment calm down and rebuild the mucosal lining. And this third product is GI Assist, and this is just a simple yeast probiotic that is in some of your formulas, I believe, Kiran, that we have just found clinically helps the Megaspore sort of latch on. So that's how I describe it. So we just call that an assist, because I do think that's just a nice assist for this little kit. And we'll get more into the specifics here. So Megaspore is a very different probiotic. I've seen some questions in the chat. How does it compare to yogurt? How does it, how would this work differently than some people have taken probiotics and it caused too much bloating or some kind of histamine reaction? So it is a very different product. And Kiran, you want to just speak to how it's different?
Yeah, so the idea behind the product is completely different than what you're used to hearing in the probiotic space, and in fact, it was kind of born out of a significant need to create something that was going to create a fundamental change in people's microbiomes. The way I came about developing this product is I was actually hired. I have a research company on the side as well, where other supplement and nutritional companies will hire my research company to do clinical studies, laboratory studies, help develop products, and so on. So we were hired about 10 years ago by a very large multinational company that is in every health food store and all that, and they wanted us to study the probiotic market and come to them with an analysis of what their competitors are doing, because they were getting a lot of, probiotics need to be refrigerated or doesn't have to be refrigerated, or soil-based organisms, 15 strains, 300 billion CFUs. The messaging is all over the place. So they wanted us to identify what was really substantiated by science, and then also make a recommendation on what the next best types of strains are in the probiotic space. Now, when we did our analysis of the probiotic industry, we went out and bought a bunch of products, started testing them and all that, started looking at the scientific substantiation behind how products were formulated. We basically found that the vast majority of it is just kind of marketing. There's no scientific substantiation to having 30 strains in a product, or 25 strains, or even 15 strains. There's no scientific substantiation for having 300 billion cells, or 50 billion cells, or 100 billion cells. Again, it was all just marketing. None of the companies had any scientific substantiation, right? It was just kitchen sink formulas. And it was driving me crazy reviewing these products over and over again, and calling the companies and saying, let me talk to your scientists. I need to understand why you formulated the product the way you did. And of course, they all hated talking to me about it. And then I would go to the store and I'd say, what are your best probiotics? And they would say, oh, all the stuff in the refrigerator, that's the best quality probiotics. And I say, well, why are they in the refrigerator? And they say, well, because to maintain them as live culture, because you need a live culture in order for the probiotic to be functional in the body. And I said, okay, so then if you keep it at room temperature, it's going to die, right? And that's why you keep it refrigerated? And they say, yes. So I say, okay, if it can't handle 70 degrees in room temperature, it's 98.6 degrees in the body, and a pH of 1, which is the acidity in the stomach, is so strong that if you were able to touch the stomach acid, it would actually burn off the tips of your fingers, right? And so, like, well, how in the world can these really delicate bacteria that have to be refrigerated, can't sit at this wonderfully comfortable room temperature, how are they going to survive through this whole gauntlet of the gastric system? And nobody ever had an answer to that, and so we started testing. Most recently, we've tested 45 of the top-selling probiotics in the US, and not a single one of them survives through the gastric system. 100% of the bacteria die going through the stomach, right? And so we started doing a bunch of research as to what kind of strains actually exist out there in the natural world that actually can naturally survive through the gastric system, actually get into the intestines, colonize, and start making a functional change. And we came across these bacillus strains. These are bacillus endospores. So these are really unique bacteria that when they're outside of the body, and their gut is their normal natural home, but they can leave the body through defecation. So when they go out of the body, they cover themselves in this thick protein calcified armor-like coating, and that allows them to survive the re-entry back into their home base, which is in the gut. Once they get in there, they bust out of this armor coating and they become a live functioning probiotic cell in your gut. Now, what was fascinating to us about what they did was they acted as the gut police. So what they would do is they have the capability of reading the microbial environment, and then they can do something called quorum sensing, where they find bad and harmful bacteria, and they'll sit right next to them and produce up to 25 different antibiotics to kill off the bad bacteria in your gut. Now, at the same time, they produce a whole bunch of prebiotics and other compounds to regrow your other good bacteria. So they completely change the diversity of the microbiome. They increase the growth of things like Akkermansia, Mucinophilia, Faecalibacteria prosnitzi, Bifidobacteria. So they're basically enhancing your garden in a real significant way that has a complete reconditioning modulatory effect on your microbiome and the function of your gut lining as well. So with that knowledge, we went back to this company and said, these are the most important strains. You've got to put this out in the market. I think these are going to play a significant role in people's health. The large company we were talking to had just gotten bought out, so they tabled everything. So we went back and got the rights to it and said, we're going to put it out in the market ourselves. And that's how the product came about. Now, understanding that these strains actually survive through the gastric system, actually get into the gut, and when they get into the gut, they can actually live there, and they can start making a significantly measurable change in the rest of the microbiome. We assumed that they may have a significant protective role in the gut. That's why we did the leaky gut study with these particular strains. We were hoping that if these strains had a protective role in your microbiome, they would be able to protect the host from this leakiness in the gut, right? So that's why we did the college student study. We found 55% of the students that we screened had severe leaky gut. We took those leaky gut subjects, put them in two separate categories, placebo and the Megaspore group, and then 30 days of taking either placebo or taking the probiotic. At the end of 30 days, we saw over a 60% reduction in leaky gut in the people taking the Megaspore. Now, at the same time, we saw changes in triglyceride levels, improvement in gut-brain communication, reduction in postprandial insulin levels. That means how your body has an insulin reaction to the food that you're eating. We saw significant reduction in 12 different cytokines that are inflammatory markers in the body. So, it's a significant change in just 30 days, and they weren't doing any other therapies. They didn't change their diet. They didn't increase mindfulness. They didn't take any other supplements. So if you add this to an overall healthy lifestyle, and then some of the other supportive products like Bridgit has, the change it would make would be significantly profound, and something that you would notice in a fairly short amount of time.
Yeah, we set this up as a 30-day kit, and certainly we have lots of people in our audience who are autoimmune, really chronically ill, and you may want to keep going because you're going to feel good on the kit. But right. I think you will, I want to start a price point that people can just kind of try it. And I think 30 days is enough to notice, what's going on. Kiran, I want to speak briefly to the fact that you said everything you tested, the bacteria died when it got into the gut, or I don't know how far it got, but I think some people say, well, wait a minute, my yogurt does make me feel better, or some probiotic I took did make me feel better. And how you explained it to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that even the dead bacteria provides some food for your microbiome. Just like our GI Assist is a transitory yeast, it provides some food for the environment. It just kind of provides some benefit, but it's more transitory. Whereas I think when people buy a probiotic, they think, oh, it's got 50 billion whatevers of, these are all going to go in my gut, where that isn't literally right. What's happening. It is creating perhaps some benefit, but not the benefit they think it is. Is that correct?
Yeah, no, we have to be careful with that too, because it's certain strains that are used, like Rhamnosus GG, for example, or Bifidus or Infantis 35624. These particular types of strains have been shown that even when they're dead and they're moving through, they can actually upregulate some of the immune response within the gut, which is favorable. Saccharomyces boulardii, which you have in the GI Assist, that's another one of those types of strains, and that's why we use it in actually one of our other products, because it's been shown to be able to pass through, and it's a yeast, so it has actually different stability through the GI tract than bacteria does. But when it's passing through, one of the things it does is it really acidifies the gut. And that helps flourish some of the good bacteria that live in the gut. Now, a lot of the pathogens and the unfavorable organisms in the gut prefer a higher pH. And so when you can lower the pH, you actually select against the growth of the pathogens and will increase the growth of your good favorable bacteria. So that's one of the things we look for when we look at microbiome modulation is, can we change the pH of the microbiome? That's one of the things the Saccharomyces does. Now, benefits that people get from yogurt actually comes from the fermentation part of it. So yogurt is basically fermented dairy. And during the process of fermentation, the organism that's doing the fermentation produces things like organic acids and peptides and urolithins and B vitamins and so on. Those things can have a nutritional value to your microbiome, but it's not going to deliver any live bacteria that's actually going to go live in your gut and make a functional change. So it's food for your gut bacteria, but it's not providing functional probiotics.
Okay. Yeah, that's well said. So there's a question on the chat that I think is timely, so I'll ask it now. I don't know if we've talked enough about the spores and how they live in aerobic and anaerobic environment. The question was, does an enteric-coated capsule survive better in the digestive tract?
Yeah, so when people enteric coat their product, they're basically protecting it against the stomach acid, right? So enteric coatings are coatings. These are usually carbohydrate type of coatings that are designed to break open at a slightly higher pH. So when the pH hits like 4 to 5, that's when it starts to break open and then release the active content. So the idea is that it'll protect whatever the active content is through the stomach, but then we'll release it in the small intestine. Now, we've tested a lot of enteric-coated probiotics as well, and what we find is the coatings typically don't survive the stomach acid either. Even though they say they do, they actually just don't survive it that well. Now, if they do survive it, and it does release in the small intestine, there's another major gauntlet for bacteria to get through in the small intestine, and that's bile salts. Bile salts that are released by a gallbladder are actually very potent antimicrobials. They kill off most bacteria that enters and is able to get past the stomach acid. Those bacteria will be killed off by bile salts. So the companies that are using enteric coating and then sending the bacteria in, they're releasing the bacteria in the presence of bile salts. So the bile salt's going to wipe them out anyway.
Yeah, so not much. No,
not much help.
Is not much help.
Yeah, it's a cool story, but it's just a story.
Yeah, it's and it's frustrating as a consumer. And I was a probiotic consumer, for many years before I found your product. I still consume your product. Is that you just don't know, because so I just appreciate people like you who do the research and come on our webinars
to explain to it. Yeah.
So I want to talk a little bit about our next product. It's called GI Restore, and this is a powder I mentioned you mix with water. And this is really more of a soothing product. I thought about calling it GI Soothe, because if you feel like your gut is always irritated and you can't tolerate a lot of foods, really this is building that layer. And it can really help, just even if you're taking it the higher dose that we can get into in the kit. It really almost just feels like everything's coming out like just this smooth pathway. It's pretty amazing. So some of those beneficial herbs and substances are citrus pectin, aloe, and marshmallow. If you're watching and you're a health coach or an herbalist, these are things that just are hold water or smooth out the gut. We call it mucilaginous. It has some mucilaginous herbs. It actually increases the ability for your body to make mucus. Aloe is also very beneficial because it's, what's the word? It can kind of stimulate stem cells and stimulate new growth in the gut. So we pair this, and I know it has some prebiotic fibers as well, Kiran, as you mentioned, being important. Our one little caveat with this guy is occasionally those prebiotic fibers could stimulate some SIBO growth. I don't think that happens with everyone, certainly, but it could with some people. So we're going to talk about a little workaround we've got for that later.
Well, and the other thing about that part is that's why it's good to take it with the Megaspore, because one of the strains in the Megaspore, the Bacillus clausi, actually helps kill off bacteria that are overgrown in the small intestine. So, you know, if there's a small intestinal overgrowth, that'll see the GI restore and start to think about feeding on it to grow further, the spores will go in there and shut that down.
Oh, I like that. I don't think I even knew that. And let's address this, because this was on the chat. And some people said, well, I had to stop taking my probiotic because it made me bloated or it made me irritable. And I believe that you're, so SIBO, which is the #1 cause of bloating, it's small intestine bacterial overgrowth, is going to be fed by lots of things, and because you're just feeding those bacteria that are too high up and producing gas. So it could be fed by lots of things, again, which is why many people can't figure out the cause. They just feel like every day they get bloated. But from what you've told me before, the Megaspore passes through well. Now, is that because of all the strains or mostly because of the strain you mentioned?
Passes through the small intestine.
Small intestine without stimulating that bacterial growth.
Well, so yeah, I mean, the Megaspore will do some colonization in the small intestine, which is actually a good thing. So every bacteria in the gut can be put into one of two categories. They're either saccharolytic bacteria or they're proteolytic bacteria. Now, those are big fancy terms, and basically what it means is that if they're proteolytic bacteria, they're going to produce gas. That's what they do. So what they'll take in carbohydrates and proteins that are coming in, and they will metabolize them and convert them to gas. They'll convert them to hydrogen gas, methane, ammonia, and so on. Saccharolytic bacteria, on the other hand, will take carbohydrates that are coming in and convert them to short-chain fatty acids. Now, what's really important about the Megaspore is those strains are all saccharolytic. So they favor the conversion of food substances into short-chain fatty acids rather than gas. The other thing that they do is then they outcompete the gas-producing bacteria. So one of the studies we did was in liver failure patients who can't eat more than 3 or 4 or 5 grams of protein a day, because if they eat more than that, their proteolytic bacteria will increase ammonia production. It's the job of the liver to clear the ammonia, but since they're in liver failure, the ammonia leaks right into their blood, and their brain swells and they die very quickly. So it's a very serious condition. It's called hepatic encephalopathy. And we did a study in these subjects with the spores, showing that the spores were able to reduce the ammonia levels by over 40% in these patients. We also see in other studies that we've done that we can reduce the amount of gas production by over 50% just by adding the spores in, because the spores are facilitating that other type of metabolism, that saccharolytic metabolism, where you take carbohydrates and food substances and convert them into short-chain fatty acids like butyrate instead of into gas. Now, the other thing that causes SIBO is leaky gut. So leaky gut will lead to something called stasis, and stasis is the lack of movement in the bowel, especially the electrical signal called the migrating motor complex that helps sweep the lower bowel and push all of the bacteria out that shouldn't be there in large amounts. And when you have leaky gut, toxins leak in from the intestines into the enteric nervous system. That's the nervous system that controls the movement of the bowels, and it corrupts the signaling in the enteric nervous system, so the bowel stops moving the way it should be, and then you have the opportunity for putrefied fermentation going on in the small bowel, because the bowel is not sweeping and cleaning everything up. So when you take the spores, they will heal that leaky gut. They will reenact that sweeping motion to help you clear out the bacteria that's building up in the small bowel. And then it also shifts the bacteria towards the saccharolytic, which is the ones that produce short-chain fatty acids instead of gas. So they will do some work in the small intestines. The vast majority of them will go into the large intestines, but what they do in the small intestine is really important, because they're fighting against the bacteria that's producing gas, they're killing off the overgrowth, and then, of course, they're also resolving the leaky gut.
Great, great. I get my special magical place that lets me forward the slide. No, not there yet.
No?
There
Uh-oh.
it is. So this is the next product, GI Assist, and the name of this yeast I can never spell the first time. It's Saccharomyces boulardii. And yeah, you've explained it a little bit about how it creates an acid environment. I kind of understood it as also creating like a kind of a food or a substrate for the megaspore and friendly bacteria. It was
Hmm.
discovered in a fermented drink in Asia as being like curing diarrhea. So someone started to study it. But
Hmm.
I found when I paired it with the megaspore, it definitely helped. So
Yeah.
yeah, so this is our just little assistant. Did you want to add to that, Kiran?
Yeah, I mean, I love Saccharomyces boulardii. It's one of my favorite strains of functional, yeast in the body. What's so cool about it is, so number one, it's one of the most well-studied strains of microorganisms in with respect to its effect on the GI. There are literally hundreds of studies on Saccharomyces boulardii. We've been using it in nursing homes, in people with really decimated guts. So these are elderly people who are on antibiotics all the time. They suffer from chronic diarrhea, chronic malabsorption of nutrients. They have really poor diets. They basically just eat pudding all day long, and it's just a sad state. And so we paired the Megaspore with the Boulardii, and we see some really phenomenal effects even in these kind of subjects. So if you're using the combination and you're doing it with an improvement in your diet and so on, you'll see some really significant effects. A big fan of Boulardii, and in fact, if you look at our ancestors, they got this combination all the time because Boulardii is naturally found on the skins of fruits and things like that. So our ancestors would have picked up the spores from vegetation and rocks and dirt and drinking water from rivers and streams, and then they would have picked up the Boulardii from picking fruits and things like that as well. A lot of berries and all that tend to have Boulardii on it, so it's a very natural thing that our body, the combination of these two types of organisms that our body's been experiencing for millions of years.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, good to know some more science on there. Magical spot. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to talk about actually, you know what? Yeah, let me talk about the kit and then we'll take a couple questions and then I'll talk a little bit more about the details. So it's one Megaspore, one GI Restore, one GI Assist. You'll also get a guide from me, like a PDF guide about foods to have, foods to not have, some recipes in there, very concise dosage guide because I know you might have questions. And then just because this is our first go round, you'll have some live time with me, which is really valuable because you can get your questions answered. So we'll do a couple of live Q&As with me, kind of a getting started as you kind of wrap your arms around all this. And then a what's next. So some people are asking about candida and parasites, and you definitely can move on to a stronger protocol if you like, or just kind of work on maintenance. So we'll answer some of those questions, and then we're going to have a webinar just on bloating with a colleague of ours, Eric Rieger, who helped create a product that we'll show in a minute, because I know that I'm really learning lately, many people have bloating, so that could
Mm-hmm.
be something you move on to with the next phase. And I think bloating could be improved, just as Kiran's describing, with what we're already doing. But if you have small intestine bacterial overgrowth that's well established, you may need to do something more. So you'll get a sample actually of this product, Atrantil, for bloating in your kit. So that's pretty awesome. And then you can also have the option to get a full size one. So here's a couple add-ons you can do to the kit. This is an oil by doTERRA, essential oil blend that is really a reason I started to sell doTERRA. I was using it on my own with my family, didn't honestly think about selling it. And I was getting such great results for digestion. And one of the oils I was using was this one. And I was like, why am I not selling these? Why am I not sharing this? I should definitely be sharing this. So I started to put it in this store. And you can also get a wholesale account, but just to cover, this has just an array of beneficial herbs for digestion. We kind of call these warming herbs in Chinese medicine. And we say the gut likes to be warm. We got to keep things moving with the warmth. So I really recommend, if you have chronic digestive issues, to do it 3 times a day, if you can remember that, because it's like a little medicine that you keep using. And this is something you could keep going on with ongoing, or you can use as needed for stomach aches. So there's just a couple little assistants here. And if you add this to your kit, you'll get free shipping. So that's nice. A little bit about essential oils here and how powerful they are. And there's a lot of controversial, taking them internally or externally and this and that. I've done a lot of research on doTERRA brand, and I really trust that it's pure. And they make reports on the compounds and the purity. And you can just really use it externally on your gut. You don't have to have the debate about using it internally. You could use it on your gut. And this is the other one we've mentioned a bit, is this product Atrantil. It has 3 ingredients. One is straight peppermint, and then 2 are derivatives of 2 different herbs. We have a little video about it on our site. But it's ironic, Kiran, I'm introducing Kiran to these folks because I think that these products go really well together. So this is a really powerful product if bloating is your main complaint. And I think you could add it in while you do the kit, or you could try the sample and do it later. So this kit is $139, so it's $25 less than if you bought everything individually, and you get all these bonuses from us. So let's stop and take questions, and I can tell you where to go to get it. I'll show that though. This is our new shop, Hormone Detox Shop, and we have the US shipping set up. The international shipping, you'll have to wait till tomorrow. It was giving me a complete breakdown today. Some of the shippers, the quotes were coming back at $90 to $100 to ship. So I'm still working on getting the right company and getting the shipping dimensions set up. So we hope to serve you, international folks, but we'll send out a replay tomorrow. So just check the replay, and hopefully everything will be fixed by then. So, Kiran, I know there's been several questions about parasites and bacterial infections. Do you want to speak to that a little bit, how this all plays into the leaky gut conversation? Like, do those things cause leaky gut, or are they just taking advantage of the situation?
Yeah, so parasites are a little bit difficult. Now, it's normal to have parasites within the gut. In fact, a lot of parasites play a significant role in upregulating the immune response and actually improving the Treg response that I talked about earlier. In fact, there are there are clinics in Europe that do parasite therapy, like helmite therapy for people with severe allergies, because they show that exposure to certain types of parasites actually have a significant benefit to your immune system. So typically when you have an overgrowth of parasites and it's apparent that it's causing a clinical issue, it is an opportunistic situation. So it means that your microbiome was perturbed to begin with. The source of the perturbation could be diet, lifestyle, antibiotic use, glyphosate, you're drinking water at home, so on and so forth. And then the parasites have a chance to kind of take over. And that's the same with most gut infections as well. The vast majority of gut infections that people think about are infections that come in from outside, like, foodborne illnesses. Most of the kind of the low-grade infections that occur within the gut are among bacteria that are allowed to overgrow opportunistically. So unless you're talking about an infection that came in from the outside, like you ate something bad, that infection will show up typically within 24 hours. You'll be really sick and want to feel like dying for the next 3-4 days, but then it goes away. The long-term chronic subclinical type of infections are just opportunistic bacteria within the gut, or candida, which is an opportunistic fungus that are allowed to take over because there's a perturbation in the gut. So basically one of the things we're showing is with the spores, for example, you can reshift the balance so that the good bacteria in the gut crowd out the parasites, crowd out the bad fungus, crowd out the bad bacteria. So it's an ecological issue, and you can shift the balance towards the favorable organisms by increasing the diversity of your diet, taking these spores, helping the GI repair itself, some of the other products that Bridget was talking about, so that you create a favorable environment for the good bacteria within your system.
Yeah, and I could say, I had parasites. I don't know if they're gone yet. But I know there is this debate, are they beneficial or not? They eat some of the bad stuff floating around in our system, and that's a benefit. I can also tell you, as I've passed them, I feel really good. Like there is a definite shift that happens and something about the way I feel. I heard on the Parasite Summit that having parasites can alter your personality. Even they have some benefit, but they're also kind of eating your nutrients and getting in the way of absorption. So I think it's a mixed bag, but I think this leaky gut kit is a really great first step. And again, we can go deeper because we can get to know each other on the Q&As and talk about what we can do for testing or other kits we can do. But I think this is a really great place to start. Do you have a few more minutes, Kiran? I know we're running.
Yeah,
Okay.
let's take some of these questions. Yeah.
Okay. So yeah,
let's get them answered.
let's tackle Candida next. How does Candida relate to all this conversation?
So I saw a question on there when I was scrolling through, and they said, it's Saccharomyces is a fungus. Is it okay to take it with respect to Candida? Because if you have an overgrowth, in fact, Saccharomyces does a great job of competing against Candida. So it is, even though it's a fungus and you feel like you have too much fungal overgrowth, maybe I don't want to take a fungus. It actually does help outcompete with the Candida itself. Now, Candida overgrowth is really a canary in the coal mine for something else that's going on in the body. Candida is a perfectly normal part of your body's microbiome. You have almost 200 different species of Candida that exist within your body, everywhere in your upper respiratory system, in your urogenital tract, in your gut. It's a very normal part of the microbiome, but when it's overgrown, it means that something is dysfunctional within your body. A lot of times it could be something as simple as too much heavy metal toxicity. And that heavy metal toxicity will actually cause suppression of your immune system. It can cause die-off in your microbiome, which allows the Candida then to overgrow. Or it could just mean your perturbed microbiome. Course of antibiotics can allow the Candida to start overgrowing. Eating too many foods with preservatives in them and non-organic foods with the glyphosate in it that kills off the good bacteria. All of those things allow Candida to overgrow. And the thing is, you can go on these like Candida protocols and take antifungals. They might help periodically, but if you don't deal with the initial reason why Candida was allowed to overgrow, whether it's the heavy metal toxicity, whether it's the dysbiotic flora in the gut or the immune suppression, then Candida will just come right back. So think of Candida as a symptom of something else that's going on. A lot of times what happens is when people feel like they have Candida overgrowth or they're diagnosed with it, then the focus is so much on the Candida itself, ignoring the actual cause of why Candida is being overgrown. And then the Candida just keeps reoccurring. You can shut it down or bring down the levels for a period of time, and then it'll just overgrow and revert again because you're not dealing with the core problem. So, this is a great system for Candida overgrowth because it starts to deal with the core issue of a dysbiotic flora, a poor functioning immune system, and dysbiosis in the mucosal lining as well.
Yeah, Candida is complicated. I'm going to be on the Candida Summit that's happening really soon. Are you on that summit, Kiran?
I don't know. I might be. I know I'm booked on a lot of summits.
I don't know. You should be on that summit. But it's a complicated topic, and yeah, a lot of people recognize they have Candida, like it's a talked about condition. And someone mentioned earlier he has a thick coating on his tongue. Yeah, this is probably oral Candida or thrush. A lot of people know because they have sugar cravings or vaginal infections. But you're absolutely right. Like it's sort of it's like a little vulture. It's not like it's not the core problem. So you can go after it, but you often have to do other things if you're going to go after Candida, like to get rid of some other infections first, do this leaky gut kit. I have rampant Candida because I still have 5 times an allowable amount of mold in my body, and it just loves that. So,
Hmm.
if sometimes if you're listening and you're like, wow, I've done everything, I've done products like this, blah blah blah, sometimes you get to the point where you do need testing to see exactly what's going on. But for someone like me with a complicated case, or if you're listening in complicated case, this is really really nice and soothing. We had Lisa ask, well, what if I have immune deficiency? Yeah, I feel good about it. One of our clients are on here who is having a lot of sour stomach and sensitive stomach, and I think this kit is really good. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, immune deficiency, I did see a question something about immune deficiency. So one of the areas, unless you have a bone marrow issue, which is where the a lot of your immune cells originate from, if your marrow is not producing enough immune cells, then the deficiency is actually in the upregulation of the signals to trigger the production of the immune cells, right? And that signal is in the gut. So there's an area of your small intestines called the ileum where they have something called the Peyer's patches. The Peyer's patches are this important immune tissue that, when stimulated, helps you produce all forms of immune cells, T lymphocytes, B lymphocytes, and so on. And the stimulation of the Peyer's patches is dependent on a healthy, diverse microbiome. So if you've got a poor microbiome that is not stimulating the Peyer's patches, that's when your immune response is going to be low and suppressed, and you would say that you have low immunity. But unless you have a genetic or some other type of bone marrow issue, you should be able to upregulate your immune response by having a diverse microbiome.
Okay. Let's see. Are there any other questions? I think we got a bunch of them. Oh, I'll ask a couple from the online because some people are in other time zones. Is it safe with breastfeeding? We'll start with that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, all of these products are absolutely safe for breastfeeding. They all help with fixing the microbiome, reducing leaky gut, improving the health of the mucosal lining. All of those things will lend to better milk production, better transfer of gut-based beneficial bacteria to the mammary glands, which are then transmitted to the baby through breastfeeding. So absolutely safe. And not only is it safe, it's really important because, remember, kids get their microbiomes from mom for the most part. So mom wants to make sure that she's transferring a healthy microbiome.
Yeah, and so I agree. I love that you're not like so politically correct here, and that you're like, oh no, like ask I like that you just say things.
I do.
Next one, I think we'll maybe make this with the last one, or there's a histamine. Do we cover histamines yet, Kiran, or no?
I don't think we did, so we should
Okay.
mention something about
We'll do histamines and then kids. So I did get a question about dosage. I will share the dosage in our guide, our leaky gut guide for kids. You have some dosing on your website, but do you just want to speak to the fact or the story behind the safety for kids?
Yeah, I mean, so my kids, for example, have been taking it since they were about a month old or so, which is perfectly normal. If you keep in mind the evolutionary biology behind these are strains that our ancestors would have found and come in contact with in the natural environment. If you think about our ancestral babies, they were born in a natural environment and then they were put in the dirt. Of course, our ancestors didn't have, wonderful, beautiful bassinets that were sterilized and cleaned and all that. So the babies were in the dirt. And one of the most interesting things about babies to me is a behavior that all babies have that we lose quickly as we become toddlers, and that's to put everything in their mouth, right? And the mouth is not a primary sensory organs for us. And so the question is, why is it that babies have this tendency to put everything in their mouth? Well, imagine an ancestral baby put in the dirt. He or she's picking up rocks and dung and dirt and sampling themselves. They're basically inoculating their system with these environmental bacteria. And as it turns out, studies show that these bacillus spores, not only do they play a role in everything we talked about, but in an infant microbiome, it plays a significant role in the development of the immune tissue in the gut, which is where about 80% of your immune tissue is. So they're extremely important and beneficial for babies as well. We start, a lot of babies, especially around a month old, and especially if they were C-section born, so that they already have a perturbed microbiome, especially if they've had to have a course of antibiotics early on for ear infection or whatever it may be, and especially if they're not nursing well, because breast milk is so important in terms of inoculating baby's gut with good bacteria. If they're not nursing well, then you really need to give them some additional help as well.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, it's so important, and I think people, we are so conservative about what we give babies, but then we give them like goldfish crackers and just
Right.
like cheese
Yes.
sticks, and I'm always just
Yes.
like cringing. It's like, oh, what do I feed my baby? Oh, I'll feed him what everyone else does: goldfish crackers and cheese sticks.
Yeah.
Yeah, so important for them to get the diversity of foods too. Amanda asked if there's a replay. Yeah, you can watch it at the same link and share that with people. Really appreciate you sharing that, Amanda. That's really great. I mean, frankly, there are a lot of people who need to hear this, like you said. I mean, when I first spoke with Kiran, I was like, whoa, I can't believe all the things I didn't understand about probiotics. And we really dropped down some knowledge bombs on the gut here that I don't think people know enough about. So it's really great. We will
Yeah.
be following up by email tomorrow. My software doesn't let me follow up with people today. But that gives you some time to fix my international issue. We're going to have a couple options. If you live really far away and the shipping is exorbitant, we'll give you an option to just get in on the Q&As and just get the information. And then you can kind of work with what you can get locally. But I'm really going for you guys internationally to fix and get you guys some good shipping rates. But if you're in the US, it's good to go today. If you add another item to the kit, you'll get free shipping, which is nice, but the shipping is really reasonable anyways. It's $6.95 right now. Oh, we didn't talk about histamines. Someone reminded me. Thank you, Ying. Is it going to bother people with histamine issues?
No, actually, it'll help a significant amount. So histamine intolerance comes from a couple of different places. One is, of course, histamine itself is the active compound that triggers an IgE type of response. So it triggers that inflammatory response. Histamine is made by the microbiome. It's made by your mast cells. It's made within your system itself. But of course, you'll get a lot of histamine with food because a lot of bacteria in food and fermented foods and in probiotics also make high levels of histamine. What's good about the spores is they're not histamine producers, or they're not high histamine producers, certainly. And so you won't get any additional histamine exposure by taking the probiotic. Now, the other thing to understand about histamine intolerance, and one of the reasons why this is increasing in prevalence, is because histamine is one of those molecules that are used as signals from the microbiome to the immune system to tell the immune system that there's an infection going on. So a lot of times if you have a chronic viral infection going on, your microbiome will produce a lot of histamine. The other thing it produces as a signal is called indole. So it produces a lot of histamine and indole to trigger your intestinal epithelial cells to activate your immune system to try to get rid of that infection. But if your gut is in dysbiosis and you can't work to get rid of that infection, you'll continue producing and having histamine type reactions. So when the spores come in, they don't themselves produce histamine, which is good, but they will then go after the overgrowth of either bacteria or latent viruses. They will help mature the peripheral immune system so that you can go after these long-term latent infections and help get rid of it. So it can help with the histamine issue in a couple of different ways.
Yeah, and Ying, I'll mention too something I learned recently, and you can hear more about this on our podcast with Laura Bryden, is that if you're in estrogen dominance, you're going to have an histamine issue. So it's not just a gut issue, it's also a hormone issue. Many people are in estrogen dominance even from a young age, from stress and just hormone imbalance, but definitely in perimenopause, you're in it. So just consider that as well. You might want to do some things. We're going to have a hormone kit in a couple of months, and you really want to nourish the progesterone producers so you can balance out that estrogen.
Yeah, and one more thing about histamine. So I think Ying said she wasn't aware that histamine was a signaling aspect to it. Histamine is also a compound that is produced in your body to actually trigger alertness and to trigger like the initial stages of flight or fight response. And so stress can actually could be produce more histamine response in your body. So if you go to the store and you look at that sleeping product called ZzzQuil, right? ZzzQuil is that OTC sleeping product. It works because it's an antihistamine. That's what it does. It actually it blocks a histamine response, and histamine in people who have an inability to sleep is typically elevated because it's an alertness compound as well. So it has a lot of signaling capabilities within the body, and so a lot of what you might be experiencing with your histamine issue is a likely chronic infection, probably too much stress, a lack of sleep, which actually causes more histamine release. So you want to make sure you're addressing all of those things. And then the probiotic with the spores do not produce histamine, so it'll be okay for you. And then the whole GI restoration system that Bridgit has created will help restore your gut so it can get rid of that latent infections.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kiran. Yeah, everyone's loving this
Welcome.
information. So great. I do have a little bit of a warning that I just have 48 of these kits. So it's our first go. It's our first go. There's actually 49 people on this call, which is funny, but 500 some signed up for the webinar. So I didn't know what to anticipate. So if you know you want one, I would suggest you get one because we can reorder, but that's going to cause a couple weeks delay. So if you know you want it, get on it. If the chat is closed and you have a question, I did put my email in here, but I'll put it again. You can email us. But yeah, I hope we provided enough information for you to understand the kit. I'm really appreciating all the excitement about the new products, and I'm always so happy to support Megaspore and get that in more people's hands. So really appreciate you guys being on here. Would love to have you in our program, and this is probably one of the few times you'll get live support through taking the kit and get a lot of your questions answered. Kiran, any last words?
Thank you so much for having me as usual, and I love what you've done here to create this total kind of gut restoration system. So I think it's super exciting that you're offering this to your audience. So congratulations on that. I'm excited to hear how people do on it. I think they're going to do phenomenally well because it's really kind of a total gut restoration system. So great job with it.
Yeah, I'm excited as well. Oh, there's a phone ringing. So maybe that's our signal. Get off.
The bad
Thanks,
signal.
everyone. Bye.
Thank you.